everyone, and welcome to another session of the Rosalind Franklin Society annual meeting. I'm Juliana Lemure, science writer at Gen, and I'll be your host for this session called Journalists Join in the Discussion. During this session, we'll consider the critical role of journalists in communicating science, the challenges of this task, and the challenges of being a woman in this role. To get into all of this, we're joined by two very special guests, both of whom you've likely seen on TV recently talking about COVID-19. Meg Tirrell is CNBC's senior health and science reporter. Meg has covered a wide range of topics, including the development of new medicines for Alzheimer's, cancer and rare disease, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to joining CNBC, Meg covered the biotechnology industry for Bloomberg News. Meg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Kavita Patel. Kavita is a primary care physician in Washington, D.C. She has also served in the Obama administration as Director of Policy for the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and Public Engagement in the White House. A Brookings Institution non-resident fellow, Kavita provides vision and guidance for the Center for Health Policy in the Department of Economic Studies. Lastly, and important for today's conversation, Kavita is an MSNBC columnist and an NBC News contributor. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Kavita.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much.
And I'm a scientist, but today I'm going to try to harness my inner Andrea Mitchell. So we'll see how that goes.
I try to do that every day.
So let's start with you, Meg. Can you start by telling us a bit about your path to your current role at CNBC?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started out wanting to be an arts critic, which really couldn't have been further from what I do now. I went to journalism school after college. I went to Wellesley for undergrad and went to a master's program essentially because I really wasn't sure how to start out in journalism. And I think a lot of people will say you absolutely do not need a master's degree in journalism to pursue the profession. And I don't think you do, but I did find that extra year really, really helpful. I went to Northwestern and I did take an arts criticism class and, I enjoyed it, but I also just kind of had this feeling like, why does anybody care what I think about this play or whatever it was? And then while I was there, I took a business reporting class from this wonderful professor, Joe Mathewson. And he had a great relationship with Bloomberg News, which had an internship program that paid $20 an hour. And I just thought, wow, that's more than I expected to make in journalism coming out of school. And so I applied and they accepted me. And I ended up staying there for 7 years. And it was just a great experience. I covered just really anything at the beginning for the first 2 years. I was kind of a general assignment, small company reporter. And it was during the financial crisis. So a lot of big companies were becoming really small companies. I covered Eastman Kodak going through and leading up toward bankruptcy, all these big names, Blockbuster, and all these small companies like Netflix before they got big. I remember breaking some news that they planned to separate out their streaming and their DVD by mail business. That was actually like a big story at the time, and now it seems so obvious. I switched over to the health team in 2009, right around when H1N1 was happening. It was an opportunity to move to another team. And I was offered either pharma or consumer products. And I thought pharma sounded a lot more interesting. I have a lot of family members who work in science in academia. And so I'm sort of familiar with the area. I never had any talent for it myself, but I have an appreciation for it and an understanding that scientists are very generous with their time and to explain to people who aren't in the space to help us understand. So I stayed then at Bloomberg until 2014 and then made the switch into television at CNBC, where I've been now for, oh my gosh, going on 8 years. So this is I guess the second pandemic I've covered if you count H1N1, but it's certainly a much different situation. I covered Ebola at CNBC. And then Zika. And so we've had these kind of come up. And while CNBC is a business network, these stories become the story. They affect the markets. They affect everybody. So it's been great to get to cover them, especially with this lens through, focusing on pharmaceuticals and understanding vaccines and drug development on a different level. It's been really helpful.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. Yeah, we're definitely going to get more into COVID-19 in a little bit. first, Kavita, how about yourself? So you wear many different hats. And so I'm wondering what motivated you to go to medical school? And then how did you get into the different paths from medical school that you have today?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I'm old, so I'll keep it brief because this could be like a 2-hour just dialogue of what I decided to do since I came to medical school. I was I went to UT Austin for undergrad and was a liberal arts major and also had a double degree in liberal arts in an honors program there and in math. And I actually thought that like my life would be, I just thought math was amazing. When I graduated in one of like the most senior math courses, I was the only woman in that classroom of probably about 120 people. And so I thought this might not be the best idea of a career for myself. So I was able to use a lot of math courses to fulfill science requirements. That was not something that was probably widely broadcast back then. So I actually applied to both law school and medical school thinking I like to talk a lot. So law school makes sense. And I really like science, especially the math side. So maybe, medicine makes sense. So I would love to tell you it was some really great story of how I've always wanted to be a doctor since I was a little child. But it had more to do with what I thought I would be good at. And I literally tried and applied to both and kind of thought about which one made sense. And the talking and science part fit more with what people told me I could do when I became a doctor. But I think that's also what led me to get I got 2 master's degrees after my medical degree because I actually kind of wanted to bring back some of that math work into quantitative and qualitative research, which is what I did for a bulk of my career early on before I came to Washington, D.C. Then I think, just to make it an even shorter kind of introduction to how I landed alongside someone who I deeply respect. I think Meg actually knows a lot more about what the data and research underlying a lot of clinical decisions than many doctors do, because we just don't get training in that in medical school. I really found myself kind of curious once I came to DC. I had a policy career. I started working as a staff director for Senator Edward Kennedy, the Democrat from Massachusetts, and principally worked on his portfolio of the NIH, the FDA, and had to get really kind of neck deep in some of the policy issues around why we weren't approving cancer drugs quickly enough. There was a lot of pressure. This was during the Bush administration, and there was a lot of pressure from patient advocates to not have the kind of typical like turnover time from application for a new drug to actual introduction into a commercial market of anywhere from 5 to 12 years. So it was really interesting to kind of apply what I knew clinically, the medicine, the science, how research studies, animal trials, clinical trials in humans, phase 4 trials, and how all of that kind of landed squarely in a regulatory agency. And then from the regulatory side, what it meant to bring something into the commercial market. I didn't deal with CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, as much, but I actually learned so much about CMS and met then, this is kind of a fun story that only happens in DC. It was actually my work then where I got to meet then Deputy Commissioner, and I forget what his title was at CMS, Scott Gottlieb, who had eventually become the FDA commissioner in the Trump administration, and also a very prominent figure on CNBC. So it's been a path that I could never have predicted when I was applying to medical school. But on looking back, I would not change any of it. But I think Meg and I can both probably agree that these are all paths less traveled and probably come with some degree of risk, but also the reward of doing things that are just pretty unconventional. At least for me, I think COVID has introduced a new aspect to that. I never could have anticipated that this pandemic would exist, that it would go on this long, or that people would want to hear me on television so much. And they probably don't anymore, but it ends up just being, unfortunately, a headline that continues to pervade our news stream.
Okay. Yeah. Terrific. Yeah. I think sometimes alternative or wandering career paths are underappreciated, but I mean, I'm really glad that you pointed out the ways that using your medical degree have created these like different perspectives in all the things that you're doing now. So I think that's really important for people starting out to hear. It's not one track, right?
Yeah, I guess probably for people who are listening, the best advice I can give, if I could give it to my younger self, would be to actually take more risks. I think that people who enter scientific careers tend to, in general, be a little bit more risk averse. We like certainty, we like kind of probabilities, and we like to have probabilities that we can forecast. I think that's certainly actually what lent me a little bit more bias even to choose a career in medicine. It felt like it was a stable career. I could find a job no matter what. And a well-paying job at that. But I would encourage people to take risks. And something that I am struggling to do all the time, but I'm grateful for with the very interesting comments that viewers send me, because sometimes the most vocal people who watch me say something are the people who disagree with me, is to actually try to find environments where you have to be around people who don't always share your point of view. So for many scientists, we tend to, because of academic tracks, we tend to be around people who choose a disciplinary focus similar to ours. We have mentors by virtue of the name who mentor us to do certain things, pursue clinical pathways, research pathways, scientific careers. It's actually quite important, I think, in society, especially the 21st century, to choose things and to take risks in which the people around you are not as familiar or might not be as familiar with what your area is, because it actually helps you. I think it just creates a more robust way of not only kind of conducting your work, but also being able to have an impact with your work.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much for that. Meg, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think I totally appreciate Kavita's encouragement to take risks. I would say the way I ended up here, it was certainly not planned. Like I could never have said when I was graduating from college, like I'm going to be the pharmaceuticals reporter on CNBC. I'm really happy that I am doing this. But you really can't plan out necessarily where you're going to be. And I think for me, I didn't take a lot of risks. I would say I kind of just kept doing like the next thing that I thought I could do. And I took opportunities when they came. But maybe taking more risks would have been interesting. Like I always wondered what would have happened if I had, either if I hadn't gone to get a master's degree or had gone to work at a small paper in a small town. It would have been so different. And I kind of went to the $20 an hour paid internship at this massive media company because it was safer and it paid me. But, I think there is definitely something to be said for taking risks if you can. But at the same time, acknowledging that you can't plan everything out in a linear path, and that will sometimes lead you somewhere really great. Just taking the opportunities that you get and making the most of them. And if they're not right, change course. But so far it's worked out fairly okay.
Okay, terrific. So one commonality with all these different paths is that we're all interested in science communication and passionate about science communication. So Meg, let me ask you, what do you think makes an effective science communicator?
Not trying to dumb things down too much. I think respecting the audience's ability to understand complicated information. Yes, translate jargon into English because people won't necessarily know what certain things mean, but not losing the nuances and the importance of what's happening in a study or whatever it is. And maybe I'm spoiled because on CNBC we do have an investor audience who just has to get into the weeds of things in a more complicated way in order to make investment decisions. So I do have a sophisticated audience, and we've got sophisticated anchors who I get to talk to. But I don't think it's the same. I do MSNBC sometimes too with a more general audience. And I did get a comment once when I was on with Stephanie Rule at Kavita. I don't know if you've had a similar situation, but I started talking about T cells versus antibodies. And she did kind of poke at me a little bit like, okay, let's move on from the T cell talk. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are talking about T cells versus antibodies right now. And if you can explain it concisely in a way that does give a picture of what you're talking about, I think it's valuable to include details like that. So that's how I try to approach it. I never try to think, oh, my audience isn't going to get this. I try to think if I can get this, everybody can get this. I'm not a scientist. So I just make sure I really understand it and then try to explain it briefly.
Okay, terrific. Kavita, how about yourself? What would you say makes an effective science communicator?
Yeah, I'll just kind of build on what Meg says. I agree with everything she pointed out, and to not assume anything really about your audience and that. But then I will also say, kind of now feeling like I've had to do it for kind of so many years, sadly, I think effective science communication is communication that doesn't kind of inject like opinion or bias in the beginning. It's clear that I have an opinion about schools being open. I have an opinion about people getting vaccinated, but leading with kind of this like, well, everyone needs to be vaccinated, period, doesn't actually like then allow for people to listen to the rest of it, which could be data and some compelling statistics about hospitalization rates, or on the contralateral with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, having to communicate like to an audience about some of the very serious adverse events as they were unfolding across the world, but also trying to kind of illustrate the benefit and risk of vaccines overall. So I do think there is just a kind of a nuance in it. And I think some of it depends on the medium. So scientific communication in 2 to 3 minutes of television airtime, you have to be very compressed. You have to think about even what Meg was saying about T cells and antibodies. How are you going to communicate that in 30 seconds with a producer telling you to rap in your ear? But you can also engage in Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. There's a very kind of useful, like kind of medium for communication and scientific communication. In fact, so much of what kind of I learned about COVID came from Twitter, because you could see Trevor Bedford, others, I think some of the folks you've had on, Angie Rasmussen, people would have the ability to tweet, even with preprints, be able to tweet kind of very concise scientific findings. And I think that has been an incredible kind of valuable lesson in all of this, to embrace multi-modalities. We've shattered the myth that you need to have a peer-reviewed article in which to communicate science. There's pros and cons to it, but I think that's been very clear.
And what about, now we're also living in, and especially building off of what you were just saying about social media, an age of tons of misinformation as well. So how do you do you shift your thinking when you're science, when you're doing your communication, when there is so much competing misinformation?
It's less about kind of how I think about competing with the misinformation and more about how do I kind of take something out of the noise. I have a bit of I'll just say in full disclosure, Meg's the journalist and the reporter. I kind of as a contributor kind of get brought in a little bit like, okay, she has the subject matter expertise, and then they don't mind sprinkling me in because of my political past with some of those comments as well. But I would just say that I try to kind of think through what is the real issue around the misinformation. Most recently, for example, CDC guidance around isolation and quarantine, chaos, confusion, even a lot of misinformation attached to it. But I've actually tried to kind of stay away, even when host Andrea Mitchell, for example, asks directly about that, answer the question with facts so that you can avoid the misinformation. But then I actually do try to kind of bring it back to, well, what is the data telling us? It's actually not as much about the, ending isolation or quarantine early. What's fascinating about the data are the people who are the least likely to get infected or most likely to be asymptomatic are people who are vaccinated and boosted. So I think it's just a kind of, where do you find that a wider view of the data both gives you a way to kind of ground facts and try to avoid or at least confront the misinformation. But then on top of it, I do think there is at least an obligation that I have to say, all right, we can put a lot of noise and front page headlines attention to CDC confusion and how many ways the CDC got the messaging wrong. But you're all missing the point if you don't see what's happening, which is this incredible decoupling of statistics around deaths, hospitalizations, and just sheer infections. And that's vaccines. And then when you add into that the statistics around vaccines plus boosters, it becomes incredible. And I don't know if, and that I think is actually where it helps to change the narrative a little bit. Not much, but it does help.
Meg, given this wave of misinformation going on right now, does that change how you approach kind of how you're transmitting solid scientific information?
where it's challenging is that it'll capture the attention of show producers who then will be like, okay, we need you to talk about the infertility thing. I'm like, well, it's really uncomfortable to have to report on something because you don't want to bring something that's untrue, to viewers, to give it more light and more attention and almost more legitimacy, even if you're debunking it. So there are all kinds of strategies with how to do this, like a truth sandwich. You state the truth at the beginning, you explain what the myth is, and you re-emphasize the truth at the end. But when they asked me to do that story, I remember it was last spring, and I felt okay about doing it because I found that public health officials in various states were bringing this up at press conferences because it was a huge reason that a lot of young women weren't getting vaccinated. And so being able to use that sound of the public health officials debunking these myths and addressing these myths, but saying that it is a huge problem that's contributing to people not getting vaccinated, and then going into the science that shows that it's not an issue, talking with an OBGYN, and then talking with somebody who studies the spread of misinformation, the deliberate spread of disinformation. All of that, I think, helped me feel like we put out a responsible story that added a lot of context to how people could think about something like this. Then there are other things, people just get really freaked out by like flu-rona, like this new variant that popped up in France. Just kind of having to it feels like a game of whack-a-mole sometimes. We're just like, that's not a big deal. That's not a big deal. Like, yes, I mean, people getting flu and coronavirus at the same time could be very bad, but it's not the kind of monster strain that's of two different things merged together that people are worried about. And this new variant that popped up in France was quickly debunked on Twitter very helpfully by virologists, by the World Health Organization. And so being able to kind of bring that information and to the producers before we put it on air, do anything with it, and just kind of saying, this isn't something we need to cover. That also gives you a lot more credibility when everybody was telling us we were overreacting to Omicron. And I was able to say, no, the way the scientific community is reacting to this variant, which then was called Omicron, is much different from how they react to other variants that happen to pop up. This is new, this is different, and it's obviously borne out.
And so what do you see going ahead now? It's 2022. What do you see, Meg, as, going into the next year? What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge? Is this going to be more of the same?
I think people are really, really tired of this. And unfortunately, it's still obviously really affecting our lives in a really major way. I mean, the modeling does suggest that perhaps we'll peak in a couple of weeks in mid to late January in the United States. It might look different in different areas of the country. Then I guess just kind of seeing where we go from here, I think there is still an open question about whether the vaccines will need to be updated to target Omicron more. The question being, does this become the dominant variant? So would it be prudent to switch, given that we see, even though there's still great protection against severe disease, obviously less against, infection? Do we update the vaccines? And then what happens in other countries around the world? Because when this comes down here, it's not ending everywhere else. And we're so tired of this, but we have to keep our eyes on what's happening, because this isn't going to end until it's over everywhere.
We talk a lot about women in science and the struggles of women making their mark in their industry. So what about science journalism or in both of your career, in all of your career paths? Where do you think we still have work to do in that area? Kavita, I'll start with you.
I've kind of witnessed over several decades now a pretty strong kind of shift to conscious awareness, both through metrics, subjectively, like, what level are women being promoted into positions of tenure, or the tenure process itself, just even medical school composition. I think where I see, so I'll put in my career path, in medicine, and kind of as a former scientist in some ways, I would say that where we really have a lot more work to do is that it's not just a kind of attention to the metrics of who gets grants and how much funding do women receive as PIs, or how many women are PIs in general, but it also has to do with kind of the environment that now both women and men are working in. I mean, some may call it balance, but I think there's very little disagreement that statistically women end up being the people who, if they do have a household, children, spouse, partners, dogs, cats, that they are the ones that have additional burdens. And when they drop from full-time equivalents to kind of part-time, I was told, for example, that, this means that you're going to kind of be less likely to be considered for some of the like key grants, key initiatives. I also think, and I'll just say this because it's something that I see and I feel more comfortable being pretty explicit about it. I think sometimes the worst offenders with trying to acknowledge the very complex lives that working professional females have are other women. So I end up being in many scenarios with very senior women who say, well, I kind of had to deal with it and nobody helped me. So you have to do it too, whether that's asking for a raise or asking for the ability to be included on certain key efforts. And then I think that women in general, this is regardless, science, arts, doesn't matter what career trajectory, we're less comfortable asking for things that many of my male colleagues don't even ask for, they assume they can get. So I think there has to be kind of a shift in that like mindset. And I also think that there's still a bias when I now wear typically, I used to never wear scrubs to clinic. I would wear like very nice clothes and be really presentable and never wore a mask with patients. That's all changed with COVID. I can't tell you unless they're patients who know me very well, and a lot of them can't recognize me with all the gear I have on. Everyone assumes I'm a nurse. And so I think that as females, and especially female scientists, no matter what path you take, there is always kind of that bias on entry that people will assume something about you. And how you overcome those assumptions is critical. I tell a lot of young women who, a lot of what I get in emails, very interesting kind of emails and direct messages. Most of my emails after when I was in the White House or after I left the White House was, I'm, a doctor and X, Y, and Z, and I want to work in the White House. How do I do that? And I think that so much of what led me to work in the White House had very little to do with how great of a scientist I was, and had a lot more to do with kind of emotional intelligence and so a lot of the things around my education, which, are hard to quantify. And then now my most common question is like, I want to be on television or I want to be in media. How do I get a career doing that? I'm sure Meg gets this a lot too. And again, I don't think I landed a contract with, actually, it'll be interesting to hear what NBC would say about this. I don't know how I landed a contract with NBC because it wasn't like they did focus group testing on me or anything like that. But I think it does still have it's the same thing. It had a lot more to do with attributes that had little to do with my degrees and specifications. That was just a bonus. So I think that females still have, will probably always have a bit of an uphill like road to climb. It's better. But I also think we need to kind of fine tune like how we approach and what our ability is to overcome some of the biases that we know are inherent to our profession.
Meg, do you have anything to add to that?
I totally agree with all of that. And I mean, I think it's pretty obvious why you have a contract with MSNBC because you're fantastic on television. You explain things so clearly and you know a lot.
Meg has been on when I'm clearly getting hammered by, especially like by some of the CNBC hosts that just go in and in and in. And I think I get an award for not falling apart on TV. Maybe that's
you do a great job. And you do it when sometimes your kids are right there with you.
There you go. Right.
It's very impressive. I would second all of that. I would say a big challenge for women is that we don't often step up and ask for things in the same way that men do, and I think it's true also that when we do, there can be different reactions to women who do that. I think just a big challenge is that our culture still thinks misogyny, to some corners of our culture still think misogyny is okay. And there's so much of that in television. I'm sure you get it, Kavita. I mean, some of the comments that I get and that my colleagues get are just unbelievable that people still think things like this. And I also think women often end up with some of the sort of chores around the office of things more than men do. And it's hard to push back against that. But I think having allies, I think also what you said, Kavita, about women needing to support women. That's hugely important in these situations, but then also just kind of creating a culture where we're supporting one another and that men are supporting women as well. I hope this is changing. I have to say, I see so much of what happens when we are in these situations where women have to take, more care of their kids than their men or, their husbands are expected to do. I haven't had that situation. My husband is taking care of our 3-year-old right now and does it every day. And he's just rearranged his work schedule, which is more flexible than mine to do it. So I do have hope, these generations coming up are different. Yes, we're a big society and there's still going to be the challenges, but I think things are getting better.
Okay, terrific. And do you have any advice for if there's younger people in the audience who are interested in getting into science communication? Any advice for them?
Make sure you work on writing. That is tremendously important in just being a good communicator, I think. And I know that is not always like the first thing that comes to somebody who studied science. Writing isn't necessarily, a skill that is worked on as much as other things and maybe doesn't need to be, but in science communication, it's obviously hugely important. I think if you're a good writer, that can really get you far. I think in terms of being a reporter, a lot of people have an idea of a job they want to do, like they want to be on TV or they want to do something. And my advice would just be a good reporter, learn how to report, learn how to do journalism, learn just the facets of that. And then you can take those skills and apply them to whatever medium you find yourself in. And there are so many more popping up now. We've got all these streaming services and there's podcasts. And so there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I think just making sure you've got firm basics is a really important way to start.
Okay, terrific. Kavita, I'm sure that there has been ups and downs in your career. So what has helped you persevere? What's been the key there?
Am I persevering? I guess that's an open debate sometimes. I feel like I do think that I go through a lot of ups and downs. So I think that I'm one of those kind of horribly transparent people. Meg knows this because there's very little that I'm very private, but I'm never Pollyanna about kind of how great things are or how bad things are, in the sense that I can have a day where I have extreme highs and extreme lows. And I find that that's actually a bit more of my norm than I had expected. And what helps me get through that, 3 things. I've gotten a very comfortable, tight circle of people who I feel like I trust. Some of them include family members, but a lot of non-family members. Very trusted circle of people that are actually outside of my profession, ironically. So not doctors, not scientists, not people in media. And I find that they are probably the one reason I can kind of persevere, because they remind me, I think it's Robin Williams who said that and I'm paraphrasing, it's not about being alone. You don't feel alone just by being by yourself. You feel alone when you're surrounded by people who kind of make you feel that way. And I think that's true. So the way I persevere is I surround myself, even virtually, with people who really value who I am and also make space to kind of value what I contribute. And that's not everybody in my professional circle. So I do find that keeps me going. The second is, this sounds trite, but try to do something that's incredibly nowhere near your profession. So for me, it's painting. I am horrible at it, but I have been painting since I was in high school. I use acrylics. I do landscapes. I kind of get myself out of my head that way. I had stopped when COVID began just because of just responsibilities. And then I just realized I was super grumpy and unhappy and gaining weight and just very not pleased with myself. And so part of perseverance was to do something that used a part of my brain that I think I just love, but don't get to use a lot. And then the third thing and the final thing I'll say is that I find that it's not self-care. I find that I've been able to persevere because I've got a family and I have every minute that feels like it's scheduled. I have found that it works to actually block parts of my schedule for nothing. I mean, and it's not, I can choose what I want that nothing to be. It's usually nothing more than 30 minutes in the beginning of my day, but it's actually helped before I start my day to actually give me some sanity. And it gives me a little bit of like a mental cushion so that even if I'm having a really, really bad day behind me or ahead of me, I've got something that I can look forward to. Even if I literally, I did this yesterday. I sat on the couch in my house and did nothing before the kids woke up. And that was just very divine. So those are 3 practical things.
That is advice I'm going to adopt starting tomorrow for 30 minutes.
And I block it on my calendar so that it looks like I have a meeting, just FYI.
Yes.
So it's not, that way nobody schedules over it and it looks like it's work. I don't call it self-care. I just call it work. It looks different though.
Great suggestion. I love it. Meg, how about yourself? Perseverance throughout the career's ups and downs?
Yeah, I would say, especially, the last 2 years covering this one topic, 99% of the time, my boss the other day was like, thanks for bringing such urgency to it. And, really, we're all so tired of it. And you really make it still seem urgent. And I was like, well, it is still urgent. And he definitely didn't mean it like that. He just kind of meant like that you could still make it feel, like it's this new topic. But I would say what I feel very lucky for is that I find it very interesting. Like I was telling my husband after this conversation, like I couldn't do that if I wasn't really engaged in the information and really enjoying understanding a lot of this science and a lot of what's happening a lot better. So I feel very lucky that I just feel really enriched by the actual work. Not to say I want to do it constantly, and I definitely don't schedule in blocks like Kavita does, but I have like a good 2-hour chunk of television after our 3-year-old goes to bed every night. So we binge watch like old shows. Right now it's Castle, the old mystery show.
Yeah.
It's not that old. It's like from 10 years ago, but just things that are completely unrelated. I'm always reading Twitter threads like by Trevor Bedford or whoever as I'm watching these things, but like it's a mental break and you just have to unplug and now it's cold, but I'm still trying to get exercise. That makes a huge difference for me. Even like doing 20 minutes of walking or like riding a stationary bike or something makes a huge difference. So, but I would say I'm just lucky that I enjoy the work.
Meg, do you have any personal heroes, particularly women?
Yeah. You mentioned Andrea Mitchell. I'd love to be her. She's amazing. So many of them. My parents are both scientists. My dad still works in academia, and my mom was in academia. She was a biochemist, but now she's retired, and she has kind of become a citizen scientist. She's got a PhD in biochemistry, but she has always been really into plants and botany and also hiking. And so she joined a native plant society where she lives, and she actually climbs mountains. She's, in her late 60s, and looks for native plants, and she documents where they are and she writes papers. And I just think it's really awesome. It's just about finding that joy and that sort of enrichment. And it's not work. She doesn't get paid for it, but she loves it. So.
Terrific. Kavita, how about yourself? Any heroes?
I have a lot of female heroes who are health services researchers and people who I kind of still try to find a way to work with if possible. Beth McGlynn, who I worked with at RAND, 20 years ago on original quality of care research studies. I can go through a number of these women, but what's interesting is actually what they all kind of did for me. They all, tried to make space to actually acknowledge that I was a little different than their typical mentees or people that they knew or worked with. And then I will throw in my on-air women I look up to, because it's been interesting to see really strong women on broadcast, both television and in print media. And I echo the Andrea Mitchell. I'm lucky because she lives in DC, and I randomly sometimes get to see her in person, which is always kind of hilarious because she always has even during COVID times, an entourage of people who are trying to get selfies with her. And it's actually quite hilarious and cute in many ways. But I also have, so I actually think a lot of those journalists are a journalist and on-air talent. Meg is included, and people I admire. I am a huge Nicole Wallace fan because she will often send like questions about how to interpret like JAMA articles. And so I mention this because I want people to understand that the intensity and curiosity about science has become universal with COVID, and the potential for how to like use that interest beyond COVID is fascinating to me. I am very hopeful nobody sees me as much anymore on television, but I do hope that people like Meg get to continue to talk about a lot of breakthrough therapies, things that people are interested in, but to get them to be interested in the science behind it, because sometimes I think before COVID, saying efficacy or effectiveness didn't really resonate, and now it does. Like I've met more people that know what an R0 is than even I thought were possible. So that is something I'm very excited about and admire a lot of the women that played a role in making that happen.
Okay, terrific. What a terrific note to end our discussion on. So that's going to bring us to the end of this session today. I want to thank both of you for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure. And to our audience, please stay tuned for our next and last session in the meeting program entitled How and When to Add Federal Leadership.